Chapter 6. Ancient Psychic Phenomena. If my remarks thus far may have led the reader to infer that I regard the phenomena of spiritism as an unmixed evil, I hasten to remove the impression. Of no phenomenon of nature can this properly be said. The phenomena of nature are the facts of nature, and it is from those facts that we must study the sciences. It is only when we wrongly interpret or erroneously classify a fact that it bears upon its face the appearance of evil, or is divested of its importance to mankind. Every fact in nature is important if properly classified and interpreted. Conversely, if the most apparently insignificant fact is improperly classified, it often becomes a stumbling block of great magnitude in the pathway of the searcher after truth. No true scientist can, or will attempt to, deny the truth of these elementary propositions. My remarks relating to psychic phenomena have thus far been made for the sole purpose of properly classifying a very important series of psychic facts, the facts of so-called spiritism. No one will deny the importance of this first step if we are to study the subject scientifically. That we must study it scientifically if we would arrive at the truth, all will admit. Psychology is, or should be, an exact science. There is no more reason why it should not be an exact science than there is why astronomy or electricity should be left out of that category. Provided always that we apply the same rules of investigation to psychology that we apply to any of the other sciences. To that end, the one fundamental prerequisite is that we carefully and conscientiously study the facts. In doing this, however, the first thing needful is to divest ourselves of all prejudice arising from preconceived opinions of our own. The second, which is equally important, is to divest our minds of all prejudice in favor of the opinions of others whose conclusions are not based upon well-authenticated phenomena. The third, and perhaps the most important of all, is that we should divest ourselves of all emotional opinions. It is to the misdirected emotions of mankind that the world has been indebted for all the opposition that has ever been directed against the progress of science. It was the misdirected and perverted emotion of religious worship that directed the tortures and lighted the fires of the Inquisition, and has again and again drenched the earth with human blood. And no one will deny that the ranks of spiritism are today largely recruited from the class of people who allow their emotions to blind their judgment. It is, therefore, of the utmost importance that we should guard ourselves against the tendency to emotionalism when studying the science of psychology. For those very emotions constitute a most important part of the facts which we shall be called upon calmly to investigate. The term psychology is derived from the two Greek words psyche, the soul, and logos, a treatise. Psychology is, therefore, the science of the soul. Like every other science, it must be studied by and through the observation of the facts pertaining to the subject treated. As the science of astronomy must be studied by observing the movements of the heavenly bodies, the science of chemistry by the study of chemical combinations and reactions, the science of geology by a study of the physical structure of the earth, so must the science of psychology be studied by and through the observation of the phenomena of the soul. To reduce my propositions to a more orderly form, they stand thus. 1. The psyche, or what I have elsewhere termed the subjective mind, is the soul. 2. The phenomena of the soul are, therefore, what are generally termed psychic phenomena. 3. The soul is the source of all psychic phenomena. 4. The emotions of religious worship and the longings for immortal life are psychic phenomena. 5. It follows that the facts which we must study and from which we must deduce all legitimate, logical conclusions relating to the science of the soul consist of observable psychic phenomena. It is only by an appeal to these facts that we can scientifically demonstrate that man has a soul. It is by reference to psychic phenomena alone that the existence of a deity can be demonstrated. Physical science can do neither the one nor the other, nor can it throw more than the faintest glimmer of light upon either question. To the materialistic scientist, physical nature conceals all that man would know of God or of his own soul. Psychic phenomena alone reveals that knowledge. The science of the soul is, therefore, necessarily the science of religion. To attempt to divorce religion from psychic phenomena is to attempt the impossible. It is only when psychic phenomena are misinterpreted that the cause of religion falls into disrepute, or that a knowledge of the living God is withheld from mankind. Ignorance of psychic laws has placed gods upon the throne of heaven, possessing all the frailties, weaknesses, and passions common to mankind. It has peopled the earth with spirits of health and with goblins damned. It has been the source of every superstition that has ever terrified the soul and warped the judgment of man. It has created a material hell and filled it with demons, a material heaven and peopled it with demigods. On the other hand, grossly as psychic phenomena have been misunderstood, the fact still remains that they have constituted the foundation of every religion worthy of the name. Such phenomena have been the only means whereby man has been led to the conception of a higher power. They have constituted the basis of his hope for a life beyond the grave, and they have furnished the evidence of the divine mission of all the epoch-making characters who have been instrumental in lifting the souls of men to a higher moral and spiritual plane. In a word, they have constituted the great bulwark which has protected mankind against the assaults of materialism and its consequent moral irresponsibility. The spiritual history of man is, therefore, but a record of psychic phenomena. In the world's intellectual infancy, all the phenomena of nature were of necessity grossly misinterpreted. Science, however, has revealed much of truth concerning the laws of the material universe. It has removed physical nature from the domain of the supernatural and safely conducted it within the province of induction. The future of physical science is, therefore, assured. None of its phenomena will ever again be relegated to the realms of the supernatural. Its future is eternal progress. Spiritual science has yet to be formulated and brought within the realm of induction. The Old Testament records furnish the most striking illustrations of what I have said of misinterpreted psychic phenomena. Much valuable time has heretofore been employed in the discussion of questions pertaining to the authenticity and the historical accuracy of the Pentateuch. Countless treatises have been written, displaying profound learning and patient research, in which are discussed questions such as whether Moses is the author of the whole, or of only a part, or, indeed, of any of the Pentateuch, whether it is an historical work or merely legendary and poetical duet, whether Ezra was its sole author, as also of all the other historical books of the Old Testament, Spinoza, J., or whether it is an agglomeration of fragments written by many men at different epochs. Much ingenuity has also been displayed in attempts to prove that the whole has a mystical meaning, in which efforts its historical possibilities are entirely ignored. The rabbis held that all but a small portion of the latter part of Deuteronomy was written by Moses. From the Jewish synagogues, this belief was inherited by the Christian Church, and it is still widely prevalent among Christians of the present day. It was not until the 17th century that the belief was seriously challenged or the doctrine of plenary inspiration questioned by any part of the Church. The higher criticism of more recent times, however, has done much to dispel the palpable errors of former beliefs and to bring comparative order out of legendary chaos. It is not my purpose to enter the prolific field of discussion which these questions present. I wish, however, briefly to touch upon what seems to me to be the salient feature of the Old Testament records, namely, their character as depositories of psychic facts. It is fashionable to deride the history of the children of Israel and of their exodus from the land of their bondage and their sorrows. The unreasoning skeptic regards it as a fiction, written in the infancy of the human intellect, by men whose minds were dominated by superstitions, or by the priesthood for their own aggrandizement and the subjugation of their followers. Even those who believe in the plenary inspiration of the Bible and the literal truth of the Mosaic account of creation find it hard to identify the God of love, mercy, and benevolence which Christ taught mankind to adore with the God of Moses, who was characterized by all the weakness, passion, jealousy, cruelty, and vindictiveness common to primitive humanity. It seems evident that between the extremes of unreasoning skepticism on the one hand and of equally unreasoning credulity on the other, the truth must be found. When it is sought in that direction, it will be discovered that the questions of authorship and dates possess very little importance compared with the insight which will be gained of the first great step in the evolution of spiritual man. As before intimated, it is from the psychical standpoint that we must study the early history of the religion of the Jews, and as it is from that religion that the religion of Christendom has been evolved. The subject possesses the most transcendent interest and importance. If anyone who understands the elementary principles involved in the production of the psychic phenomena known to this generation as spiritistic, will, in the light of that knowledge, read the Old Testament, particularly that part of the Pentateuch relating to the exodus of the children of Israel from Egypt, he will find a record of psychic phenomena unsurpassed by any of the alleged performances of the adepts of the Orient. Viewed in that light, it will be found that many of the statements there recorded, which have provoked the skepticism and excited the ridicule of a great portion of the human family, will assume such an air of probability that they may be regarded as within the range of possible history. In saying this, I do not take into account the so-called miracle of the rod of Aaron, which, thrown upon the ground, changed into a serpent. Although it is no more wonderful than many of the alleged facts of the yogis of India which seem to be well authenticated. Indeed, those feats of Moses and Aaron were paralleled at the time by those of Pharaoh's magicians and sorcerers, whose rods also exhibited the same phenomena when thrown upon the ground, albeit the rod of Aaron demonstrated his greater power as a magician. The point is that it was the same power in the one case as in the other. If the magicians did their work within the domain of natural law, we have no right to suppose that Aaron transcended that limit. Assuming the statements to be true, the only legitimate conclusion is that Aaron was the greater magician. In other words, the same principle that I have so often tried to enforce applies here, namely, that we have no logical or scientific right to attribute any phenomenon to supernatural agency when cognate phenomena are explicable by reference to natural causes. But it is not of the phenomena recorded in the Pentateuch where the modern parallels are involved in scientific doubt that I wish to speak. The salient feature of the psychic career of Moses consists in his supposed communion with God. Of those phenomena, we have innumerable parallels in modern times which are scientifically authenticated, and we know something of the laws which pertain to their production. That Moses was a psychic is evident. He was familiar with all the occult arts known to the magicians and conjurers of Egypt. He had been educated partly in the household of the Egyptian royal family, but his early training was in his mother's home and family, and he was consequently imbued with a belief in the God of Israel and reverence for his name. His conception of the attributes of the deity was necessarily limited by the prevalent beliefs of his people and the traditions of his ancestry. He was wise, energetic, and ambitious. Educated and reared in the household of Pharaoh's daughter, he was advanced far beyond his people in knowledge and practical education. He had not shared the miseries of their bondage, nor had his spirit been broken by the tyranny of their taskmasters, but his sympathies were with them, and his proud, imperious soul revolted against the oppression and degradation of his people. His mind was the storehouse of the traditions of his race, and he had faith in the promise of the God of his fathers. That promise had been a tradition handed down to the Israelites from a remote ancestry. It sustained them during all the long years of their bondage. It encouraged them during all the long and weary journey in the wilderness, and it is still a living element of the religion of that race. That Moses was thoroughly imbued with faith in that promise is shown by the facts of his subsequently reminding God of it at critical periods in the history of the Exodus. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, thy servants, to whom thou swarest by thine own self, and saidst unto them, I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken of will I give unto your seed, and they shall inherit it forever. Moreover, Moses had committed a crime which compelled him to flee from his native land to escape the vengeance of the king. During the long years of his exile, he had cherished a personal hatred of the reigning family of Egypt, for that Pharaoh sought to slay him. Undoubtedly, that feeling extended to the whole Egyptian race, and added a potent element to the combination of circumstances, all of which conspired to point to him as the future deliverer of his people from their slavery. That such a chain of circumstances would naturally be so construed by such a man as the biographers of Moses have portrayed, there can be no doubt. That this was the actual effect upon his mind cannot be questioned in view of subsequent events. His mind was filled to saturation with the autosuggestion which crystallized in the vision which he saw on Mount Horeb, and which found voice in the command there given to go into Egypt, deliver his people from their bondage, and conduct them to the promised land. In view of the developments of modern science, there can be no other rational interpretation of the phenomenon alleged to have occurred on Mount Horeb. He was a psychic. He subjectively saw the vision of the burning bush, and he subjectively, clairaudiently, heard the voice. His education and habit of thought produced an autosuggestion that it was the voice of God, and, true to the universal law of suggestion, it assumed to be the voice of God. The effect of this vision and of this command upon the mind of such a man as Moses could have been no other than what it is represented to have been. It gave direction, tone, and color to his whole subsequent career, and the events which followed constitute a history of psychic phenomena which find many parallels in the subsequent developments of psychic research. Doubtless many of them have been exaggerated by his historians, and many have been evolved from their inner consciousness. But enough remains, after all due allowances are made, to constitute a history the credible events of which are of the utmost value to mankind, for without them the history of the evolution of __ the spiritual man would not be complete. It is not my purpose to trace in all its details the history of the psychic manifestations recorded in the Old Testament. My primary object is to suggest a line of study which cannot fail to interest the student of psychology and which may lead to important conclusions. It is important, however, that the salient features of the communications which it is alleged that God made to Moses and the prophets should be noted, for it is by the character of the communications themselves that they must be judged. If they actually emanated from the deity, surely there will not be lacking internal evidence to sustain that hypothesis. On the other hand, if they emanated from a finite intelligence, their character and content cannot fail to demonstrate the fact. In other words, we must apply the same standards of comparison to the psychic manifestations of Moses that we employ when estimating the value and determining the source of the messages delivered through the psychics of today. The most ardent spiritist, possessed of sufficient intelligence to seek shelter during the progress of a storm, would not ask us to credit the statement of a psychic that a message emanates from the spirit of a Webster, when it is couched in the language of a stevedore. Nor can we be expected to believe that a message emanates from the deity when we find that it exhibits all the passions and frailties of our common humanity. It will not be denied by the most ardent advocate of the dogma of plenary inspiration that the God of Moses, as represented in the Pentateuch, exhibited many of the frailties and some of the vices of human nature. Nor will it be denied that this fact has been a potent weapon in the hands of skepticism in all ages of the civilized world. The contrast between the God of Moses and the God whom Jesus proclaimed to mankind is too violent to permit even the most ardent Christian to recognize their identity. Hence the resort to the theory of the symbolism of the Pentateuch on the one hand and of its mysticism on the other. It was a wise remark of Dante that, before we attempt to explain the mystical meaning of a passage of Scripture, it is well to be certain that the passage is mystic. This rule embraces a world of practical wisdom, but it is not generally followed. Hence there has been a great deal of mystical meaning extracted from the Bible where no possible mysticism was intended, and much symbolism has been drawn out of passages that are not symbolical. It may be difficult at times to determine whether or not a mystical meaning is to be drawn from a particular passage, but there is one characteristic the presence of which renders it reasonably certain that a passage is neither mystical nor symbolical. When the author assumes Job be relating historical facts, and the circumstances which he details accord with the experience carried of mankind, it may be safely assumed that the passage is not mystical. It may be fiction, but it is neither mysticism nor symbolism. The application of this test will remove a very important part of the Old Testament outside the range of the symbolical theory. This remark applies particularly to the psychic phenomena of which we have been speaking. As these phenomena consist largely of the alleged communion of God with Moses and the prophets, I propose briefly to examine one or two examples which seem to combine the essential features of them all. One of the most striking examples of the intensely finite, human character of the God of Moses is found in the advice given to the latter during their first interview on Mount Horeb. After commanding Moses to go to Pharaoh and demand the release of the children of Israel, and promising to conduct the latter to a land flowing with milk and honey, he said, "And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, and it shall come to pass, that, when ye go, you shall not go empty, but every woman shall borrow of her neighbor, and of her that sojourned in her house, jewels of silver, and jewels of gold, and raiment, and you shall put them upon your sons, and upon your daughters, and you shall spoil the Egyptians." Comment upon the intensely human character of this advice would seem superfluous. Perhaps the best illustration of the human characteristics of the God of Moses is found in the 32nd chapter of Exodus. It will be remembered that when the children of Israel arrived at the foot of Mount Sinai and pitched their encampment, Moses went up into the mount to commune with God and remained there 40 days. It was then that the tables of stone were prepared and written with the finger of God. The account of the events which happened during the long absence of Moses continues as follows. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron, and said unto him, Up, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we wot not what is become of him. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings, which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, and of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation, and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early on the morrow, and offered burnt offerings, and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink, and rose up to play. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go, get thee down, for thy people, which thou broughtest out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly out of the way which I commanded them. They have made them a molten calf, and have worshipped it, and have sacrificed thereunto, and said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which have brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And the Lord said unto Moses, I have seen this people, and, behold, it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation. And Moses besought the Lord his God, and said, Lord, why doth thy wrath wax hot against thy people, which thou hast brought forth out of the land of Egypt, with great power, and with a mighty hand? Wherefore should the Egyptians speak and say, For mischief did he bring them out, to slay them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from thy fierce wrath, and repent of this evil against thy people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, thy servants, to whom thou swarest by thine own self, and saidst unto them, I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken of will I give unto your seed, and they shall inherit it forever. And the Lord repented of the evil which he thought to do unto his people. Of course, there will always be room for a variety of opinions concerning the true interpretation of these passages of Scripture. By the unreasoning skeptic, they will always be regarded as purely fictitious, although we have no logical right to dismiss them thus so long as there remains any other rational interpretation. A book which, in all ages of the civilized world, has been regarded by a large and intelligent part of the human family as sacred history, cannot be dismissed without a respectful hearing. By many, these passages will always be regarded as symbolical, although it is difficult to imagine what they can possibly prefigure, what practical lesson they can teach, what principle they can symbolize. By a few, they will always be regarded as literal truth, written by divinely inspired men. Although it is difficult to imagine how they can reconcile the crude and primitive conceptions of God which these passages develop with that grand and noble conception of the deity which Christ taught to mankind. By most people, however, the Pentateuch will be regarded as a collection of traditions handed down through many generations, corrupted in their transmission, recorded by different individuals, and collected and arranged by some one or more writers not definitely. Reason: we have no difficulty in tracing the expression to the subjective mind of Moses himself. This view is still further confirmed by the attitude of objective Moses. His reason told him that it would be highly injudicious, to say the least, to utterly consume the children of Israel, and accordingly he proceeded to argue the question with God and advise him against such heroic measures. So cogent were his arguments, or, to speak in modern scientific phrase, so potent were his suggestions, that God is represented to have repented of the evil which he thought to do unto his people. It needs no argument to convince the intelligent reader of the absurdity involved in the supposition that finite Moses was able by argument to convict of wrongdoing a God of infinite intelligence, mercy, wisdom, goodness, and power, and cause him to repent of his evil intentions. It is self-evident that the only rational explanation is that given by Maimonides, who flourished in the 12th century, and was doubtless the greatest Jewish philosopher the world has ever seen, namely, it was objective Moses talking with subjective Moses. This is certainly the only explanation that will harmonize all the alleged facts and give coherency and consistency to the Old Testament accounts of the intercourse of God with man during the Mosaic dispensation. The same hypothesis applies with equal force to the intercourse of God with the prophets and seers, from the days of Abraham to the advent of Jesus of Nazareth. Studied from this point of view, the facts related will be found to be illustrative of the principles and laws which modern scientific research has brought to light. As I have before remarked, the Old Testament is a record of most remarkable psychic experiences, a vast storehouse of misinterpreted and wrongly classified psychic facts. But, as I shall attempt to show in the ensuing chapters, they are facts which, properly classified and intelligently appreciated, are of the most transcendent interest and importance to mankind.